So we're here today to discuss, I believe the title of this will be called something like the psychological drivers of the metacrisis and what possible responses might look like. And so I'll start briefly with what do we mean by metacrisis, and then ask you to share some of the short version of the models that you have shared at great depth in your writing and your work, and ask you to also share opening frames so that people who aren't already familiar with your work can kind of come along, though everybody should, if they're interested in this, go deeper. There's a lot of resources to go deeper. I'm also not assuming, since we all just know each other a tiny bit, enough to have a sense of shared interest, but not enough that we've already done this. This is extemporaneous, which is part of what makes it very interesting to me. So I'm not assuming that either of you share the exact same assessment of the metacrisis. That's not implicit in you being here, but I know from our conversations you both share a sense that the state of the world has problems and impending risks that are serious, that are not automatically resolving themselves, that are novel in history. So we can just say the challenging state of the world. What in the nature of human mind, in the nature of human conditioning experience, we might even find that the term psychology or cognitive drivers are insufficient, which is fine, has brought us here, and what might a different relationship to human mind, psychology, cognition look like that might allow a more viable, better future. So just briefly on the metacrisis frame, before World War II, there was no risk that we could very quickly destroy the entire habitability of human civilization. That was brought into being with very powerful technology, nuclear weapons, and for the first time ever, we had the ability to make a series of bad decisions and radically change the possibility space of the world. Before the Industrial Revolution, we didn't really have the capability of destroying the biosphere at scale. That's not as fast. That takes a few hundred years, but we're at the place where the planetary boundaries in terms of species extinction, in terms of chemical pollution, in terms of many planetary boundaries are being crossed. The Stockholm Resilience Center published its update to the planetary boundaries framework just a few days ago that showed of the 9 major boundaries they've identified, we've radically crossed 6 already, which means who knows if we were to change the direction already what would happen. And that was the result of the Industrial Revolution and the technology that it made possible, moving us from 500 million people before the Industrial Revolution to 8 billion people, and increasing the resource consumption per capita by about 100x in the industrialized world. So 16 times the population, 100 times the resource consumption per population. Obviously, without advanced tech, we couldn't do that. So there's something about the crises that we're facing, and then obviously AI and synthetic biology and drones and cyber weapons and the radically complicated 6-continent supply chain that is all a very novel human technological development that wasn't true in any previous age. Without human technology, there is no global existential risk that is human-induced. There might be a meteor or something, but not anthropogenic catastrophic risk. So we're in a unique position in time. The polycrisis is a frame that a lot of people have heard that says, rather than just focus on climate change, or just coral, or just species extinction, or just nuclear, we have to focus on all these issues. And we have to recognize that they can interaffect each other, that one of these issues getting worse can cascade into other ones, and that sometimes the solution to one can make other ones worse. So we've got the answer in World War II to how do we not have nuclear war was mutually assured destruction and the Bretton Woods global financial system and a whole bunch of the whole post-war order, which did mean we didn't have nuclear war between superpowers. But it was also part of what led to the 6-continent supply chain and exponential growth connected to a linear materials economy that have pushed us to the planetary boundaries. And so we can see solutions to some problems can end up leading to other ones. The metacrisis frame, the slight distinction from that terminology from the polycrisis is that we're not just looking at the mini crises and how they can cascade, but that there are underlying dynamics that give rise to them. Obviously, humans are animals. We're part of nature. We're also pretty obviously unique. When you fly into London or into New York or whatever, and you look at the world, you see the Anthropocene in a way that, the next most environment modifying creatures are things like beavers. This is obviously a radically different scale of environment modification. And so there's something about human technology that arises from something about human mind, both our capacity to create it and then also how we utilize it. So some people look at the origin of the metacrisis starting with stone tools. Some look at it starting with the agricultural revolution and the plow, or the industrial revolution, or various places that I think they're all interesting. But if we simply say we have a bunch of risks to civilization's ability to continue well, that are real, worth considering, and different than they were historically. It's also worth stating that most early civilizations don't still exist. There is no more Egyptian or Ottoman or Byzantine or Mayan empire, and the collapse of those civilizations has been academically studied, but they weren't global civilizations. So there is some precedent that civilizations have a life cycle. We have the first 6-continent global civilization, meaning the tech that is recording this can't be made in any country in the world. The internet that is broadcasting this to people requires this global civilization to produce. So, metacrisis. I think everyone is aware of there's a lot of risks that we face, and we can look at the economic drivers in terms of perverse incentives and externalized costs. We can look at the game theoretic rivalrous drivers in terms of arms races and tragedy of the commons. We can look at the theory of technology, the way that technology itself ends up shaping mind. We can obviously look at things deep in the nature of human psychology, our value systems, our cognition. It's pretty clear when we look around that none of the other animals or plants are causing possible self-induced extinction of planetary systems, right? There's no planetary boundaries as a result of the activity of deer or algae or oak trees. So there's something unique about humans. Is this innate to human nature and there's no way of escaping it? Is this something that human nature can do, but is not the only thing it can do? That can be conditioned, that could be conditioned differently. This is what we're here to explore today. There's no planetary boundaries as a result of the activity of deer or algae or oak trees. So there's something unique about humans. Is this innate to human nature and there's no way of escaping it? Is this something that human nature can do, but is not the only thing it can do? That can be conditioned, that could be conditioned differently. This is what we're here to explore today. Ian, obviously, your book, The Master and His Emissary, kind of answers this question in a way, which is, though it's coming from a different angle, getting the master and emissary wrong could be said to be the cause of all the crises that we face, the situation we're in. For those who don't already have that framework, do you want to share your introductory thoughts on the human condition that has brought us here?
Yes, I agree with you wholeheartedly that we need to look for underlying causes of a whole pattern of events that are not just unfortunate things that happen to happen. You know, we were doing very well, and then suddenly people said the climate was changing and the seas were polluted and so forth. There's a whole range of events that can be traced back to the inevitable consequence of a certain way of looking at the world. And that way of looking at the world is, in my view, associated with and driven by a model of the world that is present to the left hemisphere in a way that is not the case with the right hemisphere. In brief, the right hemisphere seems to be more in touch with presence, with what actually experience comes to us and what we inhabit, whereas the left hemisphere is providing a representation no longer the presence, but a map, a program, a theory, a diagram, but something abstracted, categorical, removed from, and not having the characteristics of the world that it is intending to map. Now, I mean, I should say that to anybody who doesn't know my work, you've probably heard that everything to do with hemispheres is wrong, and that it's outmoded and science has got past it. This is not true. If you don't know my work, then forget almost everything you think you know about hemisphere differences. They're not the ones that you were told. But there are, although we got the differences largely wrong, not entirely wrong, but mainly wrong, that doesn't mean to say that there are no differences, and it wouldn't be important to find out what those differences are. That's something I've researched for about 30 years. And in short, the difference comes down to ultimately a mode of attention, which is an evolutionary development that goes back pretty much as far as we can trace it. We think back to trilobites and possibly even beyond. So this is something in which there needs to be two ways of attending to the world that are both very important, but appear to be mutually incompatible. One is that with which we grasp things. We need to get things in order to survive. We need to get food, we need to handle twigs to build a nest or sticks to build a shelter, whatever it is. We need to be able to latch on to something precisely, target it and get it. And that's so important that in a way, one whole half of one's brain is largely geared to this particular end, that of power. But if you pay only that attention to the world, then you will be very vulnerable because you won't see the predator. You won't see your conspecifics. You won't see everything else that's going on, of which you need to be aware. And so effectively, this is a difference in which one hemisphere pays a very narrowly targeted, precise attention to a detail in order to grab it, and another kind of attention which is broad, open, sustained and vigilant and on the lookout for everything else. Putting it very simply, those two kinds of attention change what we find. No neurologist in the world will dispute that the two hemispheres attend differently. It's very clear they do. And no philosopher will dispute the fact that attention changes what it is you see. So at the end of this, fairly obviously, if we attend in two different ways, we see two different worlds. I'm going to grossly simplify here. But effectively in one, that of the left hemisphere, the world is made up of little bits that attract attention. And they're things that we're already targeted on because we know we want them. They're isolated, they're decontextualized, they belong to categories, they're abstracted, and effectively lifeless. Whereas in the right hemisphere, it sees that everything is ultimately connected. It's connected obviously to the context of things that are immediately around it or particularly powerful, but it's ultimately connected to everything beyond that. That the world is never fixed in the way the left hemisphere needs to fix things in order to grab them. It's not built up out of slices or pieces, but is in fact a whole seamless flow, a very important word. And in this right hemisphere world, implicit meaning is understood because that's contextualized, and part of the context of that is emotion, the body, other people, the world at large. So you've got a kind of mechanistic reductionist world subtended by the left hemisphere, which is just a representation or a useful diagram. And you've got a living, complex world, on the other hand, which has characteristics which are very much harder to pin down, but involve all the richness and meaning in life. Now, what I believe, and in The Master and His Emissary, my earlier book, I traced, in the second part, a sort of path through the history of the West from the ancient Greeks to the modern time, in which there were rises and fallings of civilization, and in which what happened was that in each civilization, the two ways of seeing the world were used fruitfully together. And this is not a difference just between science and the arts. Science needs both kinds of attention. The arts need both kinds of attention. And this is how they flourished to begin with, and were highly creative. But over a length of time, they overreached themselves. They became too big. They became stereotyped. They needed global administration that could be rolled out to parts of an empire. And so we entered into a world very much like that of the left hemisphere, and very soon the civilization, either the Greek or the Roman, collapsed after this moment appeared. I mean, a complex story, but that's it in outline. And I think that we're in a third wave of this, if you like, in the West, which began in the Renaissance with an incredible flourishing, almost unequaled anywhere in the world at any time, of everything, of interest in the sciences, in the heavens, in art, in sculpture, in music, in poetry. This is an incredibly rich time. And then from about the end of the 17th century, very roughly, with the scientific revolution, we began to believe that we could understand everything in terms of mechanisms. And this was a useful way to think. And indeed, let me be the first to say that we have benefited from it in many ways. We have developments that very few of us would wish to be without as a result of it. But unfortunately, it led to a philosophical error. And it's not just, as it were, a philosophical error in an abstract way. It's one that runs deep to the nature of how we experience the world. That is, we believe that the world is made up of parts, and that we find reality by going down and down and down until we've got bits that are almost identical to one another. Whereas in fact, almost the opposite is true, that everything happens out of the coming together into complex wholes. Now, when I say coming together, I'm suggesting that we do actually temporarily start from, or temporarily from parts, but we don't. In our minds, in our left hemispheres, we start from parts, but in reality, things are whole. And what we call parts are wholes at another level, and they can't be understood only by the parts. This is a theory which is sometimes called a Gestalt theory, because the Germans have this word Gestalt, which we don't have an exact equivalent of, which means a whole, which cannot be accounted for by the sum of the pieces, the parts. And we've lost that insight, and I think that what has happened is that a combination of factors, and it's not exhaustive, but the rise of capitalism, the development of empires, both geographical empires and commercial empires, thinking in terms of global generalizations, have led us away from the reality, which is always unique, implicit, wrapped up with value, not just being sort of facts on their own, which is not to say, by the way, that I don't have any truck myself with the idea that we all just make it all up to suit ourselves. No, that's not the case. But nonetheless, our reality is something we experience as a relationship between us observing and whatever it is that is observed. And this goes both ways. We are affected by it, and we affect what we see. We literally change what there is there to see. Now, that vision is quite different from the one we have, that if only we can master more and more using left hemisphere kinds of mechanism, we will achieve power, and power will make us happy. But the roots of happiness are very other than that. I'm sure we'll come on to that. But effectively, we think we've accounted for everything when we think in terms of matter, but much more important are values, a sense of purpose, and as far as I'm concerned, a sense of the sacred. So that's really where we're at, and I think recovering some of what we've lost is critical to making any progress. We can't just sticking plasters on the cancer. We need to eradicate the cause and change the way in which we think about ourselves, the world, and how we relate to it.
Before we move to John's opening comments, for those who aren't familiar, would you explain why you use the term master and emissary?
Okay, this is a kind of a fable in which there is a wise spiritual master who looks after a small community so well that it flourishes and grows. After a while, he realizes he can't look after all the business of the community himself, not just because there's now too much of it, which is part of it, but also because if he's to maintain his overall vision and to see the whole, he mustn't get distracted by detailed bureaucratic concerns. So he appoints his brightest and best to be his emissary and go about and do the administrative stuff, a high-level assistant. And unfortunately, that assistant is hubristic, knowing much less than the master. He thinks he knows it all. And he thinks, in fact, of course, he is the real master. and because of his lack of knowledge of what it is he doesn't know, he, the master, and the civilization fall into ruins. And that obviously is an allegory which could be applied, I believe can be directly applied to the idea of the relationship between these hemispheres, because one of them actually sees much more, is wiser. I'm not just using figures of speech. We know, and in the book I demonstrate how we know, that the right hemisphere is not just more emotionally and socially intelligent, which many people might assume is the case, but also more cognitively intelligent. So that where we have some evidence about what has happened to somebody's IQ, we have measurements before and after, say, a stroke. Where there has been a significant drop in IQ, the insult is almost always in the right hemisphere. So it's very important that the right hemisphere should remain the position of the master. And as long as the hemisphere follows the direction of the master that sees more, it's very helpful and useful. It's a good servant but a very poor master.
So the question of why in the global civilization the emissary became dominant relative to the master is something I want to get back to, but thank you very much. That was great opening. And
what we're coming back to there is that, again, there is this contrast between a connected world, a relational world in which the values come out of the relations, and another kind which is a linear world of target getting, goal getting, in which we think that what is valuable will come out of completing that goal. And it doesn't.
yeah. So
I want to pick up on what you said,
Go ahead.
though, because I think that distinction is very important that you made, and here there's an ambiguity in taking a perspective. You can take a perspective in that calculative way you just said. That's different from taking up a perspective in which you care and you try to see the world from that perspective.
this is the danger in teaching people to perspective take, like the way rhetoric can do it.
Yes.
Is you can create a very good lawyerly person. Like what I found is the people who are best at perspective seeking are either empaths or sociopaths.
Yes.
Right? They're good at perspective seeking because they really feel what other people feel and they're seeking to, or because they actually don't have any binding to anything real. They can take whatever perspective happens to have utility without caring about its relationship.
That's right. Right.
And so that's the thing one has to really watch out for.
Yes.
Is the simulation of empathy.
And so,
And it brings up something. So you were talking about Christianity binding game theory.
Yeah.
I'm not a Christian scholar, so I'm just going to, from the outside, say the fact that in the name of Jesus Christ, who said, "Let he who has no sins cast the first stone," we were able to do the Inquisitions is a really interesting act of mental gymnastics.
yes.
And so I see that wherever there is a relationship to the sacred that is authentic, and it starts to develop the ability to really move people, there's power in that, then those who are seeking power seek to capture it
Yes.
and corrupt it. And so then all the religions become these mixed bags of an authentic, beautiful thing and the way power ends up capturing them. And if they don't orient to power, then they usually lose in a holy war, their population doesn't become very big or something like that.
Well,
I would love to hear,
Yes.
so because there's, how do we have a proliferation of the sacred for which someone will make real sacrifices and for which whole populations will, that doesn't lose to other populations that don't do that, and that doesn't get captured by power and perverted and distorted?
Right. Okay. So first of all, agreed. But I want to say, well, the notion of restraint. Christianity was successful in pretty much keeping it as part of the cultural cognitive grammar that people other than the male citizens were actually persons. It was successful at turning infanticide into an accepted practice into something we find horrific. So yes, I'm not saying that the power structures came in, but there was also enough. I mean, we are running on the fumes of the Christian sacred canopy, and it's been what has been still keeping some restraints on this otherwise Molochian machine that's running. And I want to, what I'm trying to say is, I want to give us a sense of hope about this, that it's not the sacred emerges and then it gets consumed. The sacred emerges. There is the pushback. There's the reframing. There's the power consumption, but some of the underlying cultural cognitive grammar has been fundamentally changed. We haven't gone back to the Bronze Age. We're still post-axial. We haven't gone back to the pre-Christian age. We're right. That's not what happened. And so I'm saying, I'm not denying that, right? I'm not denying that there's the threat. But what I'm saying is, but if we could be more clear about what gets preserved across the, I don't know what to call it, the re-entrenchment of the power dynamics, and could we better this time focus our attentions there, focus our cultural and even our political commitments, we could perhaps do it better this time.
I mean, I think we must. This is exactly brings up a question I wanted to ask you. Is in the parable that you told of the master and the emissary, I might argue that the responsibility for the failure of that civilization or tribe, or whatever you want to call it, was the masters, not the emissaries. Because the master obviously misassessed.
The master would probably have agreed with you.
Yes. And so rather than say the master was wise and the emissary wasn't, so he did a Dunning-Kruger thing and messed it all up, the master was missing a certain kind of wisdom in his assessment of the actual realistic capabilities of the emissary. There was some stuff in his noticing the whole that he wasn't noticing that was really critical for him to ultimately still hold responsibility. So there's an uptick in the master capability that could have kept that relationship right.
Yes.
So there's something about needing to be power literate to be able to keep power from corrupting a relationship with the sacred.
I mean, rather than say that the master was deficient in some way, one would say that there was an important relationship here which required a certain degree of vulnerability. So the master couldn't remain invulnerable because he realized that he needed to not concern himself with certain things if things were to survive. So there isn't a squeaky clean answer to this. He had, in a way, to trust. In some ways, it's very like the story of God and Satan, that Satan was Lucifer, the light bringer, the brightest of the angels, God's right hand. And because of his power hungriness and his envy of God, everything fell to ruin. But at the end of that story isn't ruin, because Christianity, again, I'm becoming more and more convinced during our conversation, if nothing else comes out of it, how very, very important the sort of overarching effect of a religion such as Christianity is for the survival of a civilization. I mean, I've always felt that, but I see it more and more in what we're talking about. But what you adverted to earlier was the necessary sort of supervision, and that is a difficult balancing act, as it is for the master and the emissary. And there's another fable which I tell at the beginning of part 3 of the Matter with Things, which is an Onondaga legend. They're an Iroquois people. And they had the story of how, because creation was waning, there were these two brothers who were sent to sort of regenerate the power of the universe. And these brothers are not equal. Like the master and the emissary. One of them is wise, and he is called the one that holds the earth with both hands. The other is called hard as ice, the flint. And his value is that he's got a tool that his father gave him, which is speech, and the other is an arrow with which he can shoot. Now, this is an extraordinary, just starting there, division between, as it were, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. But the story gets better and better as it goes on. I can't tell the whole thing, but those who are interested in the recording on YouTube of me reading the introduction of this chapter in which we tell the story. But effectively what the good brother realizes is the bad brother tries to imitate the good brother because he's envious of him. He sees the good brother creating all kinds of wonderful things, birds and beasts and flowers, and he tries to create, and he produces only thorns and flies and bats. And there's a sort of sense that he is dangerous left to himself. But he must also not come too close to the good brother, because the good brother needs to preserve a degree of his independence without which he is no longer himself. So they can't fuse, but one needs to be subservient to the other. The one needs to have power over the other. But that is not something that can ever be secured 100%.
Right.
So you could never have the situation where the one that is wise has that power, because one of the terms on which wisdom exists is that it sees beyond power. Now, I know that you've made a very good point that there needs to be a certain degree of sort of watchfulness and power awareness. I agree about that. But quite how this is managed in a way that doesn't actually vitiate the whole business of wisdom, because in most cultures, wisdom is associated with, well, in Chinese, with wu wei, within action. The master does nothing, but nothing is left undone. These remarkable and beautiful sayings of the Taoist literature. So we have to somehow find a way of making that work. And I don't know what your ideas about how that could be made to work are.
A close friend and colleague of mine that you both know, Zach Stein, talks about the distinction between power differentials in an educational setting versus in most traditional power settings. Specifically, he's talking about educative authority versus propaganda in terms of information asymmetries. And that the key distinction, and this gets fuzzy, but the key distinction is that someone who has information asymmetry relative to someone else who could use that asymmetry to maintain the asymmetry and grow it, which is the impulse of power traditionally. In the educative example, the educator recognizes that they have an information asymmetry, but they're in a kind of fiduciary relationship where their goal is to actually bring the student up to symmetry with them and even beyond. So their goal is not to maintain their power asymmetry. They use the power asymmetry to close it. And whereas in most power dynamics, if someone has an economic asymmetry, they use that increased economic power, political power, to both maintain it and grow it.
He, according to the Judaic tradition, has a particular role that only it is capable of carrying out, which is to repair the shattering, tikkun, repair. And the idea is that we are tasked with creating again these vessels so that they are more beautiful than they were before they were shattered. Mm-hmm. And the image that always comes to mind for me here is the Japanese art of kintsugi, whereby a piece of ceramics that is broken is repaired, sometimes with lines of gold, and is considered more special, more precious, more beautiful afterwards than it was before. Now, if it is true that we have the capacity to see how to repair things, and no other beings can see that, and I think that is probably right, it's no disrespect to the rest of animal life, that probably we have this ability to see other things and see beyond and foresee things in a way that they probably don't. So I think if that's the case, then we have a special role there, and we may even have a role in bringing about the existence of God, because that may sound very strange and possibly blasphemous, but the way in which I think this works is like this. We all know Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager was a simple one. Either there is a God or there isn't. If there is a God, then it's very important that we should recognize and reciprocate our relationship with that God. If there is no God, then it won't do us any harm to behave as if there was a God. But I think there's a third possibility, which is McGilchrist's wager. And it has the first two of Pascal in it, but there is a third one, which is that maybe we play a role in the development, the evolution, the furtherment, the fulfillment of whatever is divine. And if that's the case, then once again, we have an incredibly ennobling obligation, which is to make sure that we do help that good progress in the world. So on various levels, to do with how we dispose our attention, the role we play in repair, the role we play in furthering and bringing about the divine, we can influence things. And we may not be able to stop certain specific wars or whatever, but that's never been part of what is imaged here. Part of what is imaged here is that we, like it or not, are gathered up into something that we have to respond to. And I believe that the reason for there being life at all, and especially human life, is because whatever it is that is the ground of being needs response. It needs that response. And while it can be satisfied by the response of the inanimate world up to a point, what life brings, because I believe all life is sacred, but also the inanimate is sacred as well. The difference is not that one suddenly is involved with consciousness and the other isn't. I think they're both manifestations of consciousness. But the thing about life is that it can respond enormously much faster and to a greater extent, so that things can move instead of having to wait for this very slow process. With creatures like ours, there can be an acceleration of the evolution of the cosmos and the divine being that grounds that cosmos together. So all in all, there is an enormously optimistic, in my view, and real, and I'm a skeptical person in many ways, but I'm also skeptical of skepticism when it rules things out that we should open ourselves to. And if I'm honest about my thinking, my reading, my experience of life as a person, as a doctor, and so on, I do believe that this is the way the cosmos is and how we relate to it. And that is surely something that brings hope, brings dignity to the human condition. And it also takes the burden off us of having to solve certain specific problems. I'm not saying we shouldn't try to solve those specific problems. We must. But it's, in a sense, secondary. It's like the role of the emissary is to get on and find ways of, purifying the oceans. This is terribly important. But it mustn't stop there. Because, as I say, you could purify the oceans, you could save the rainforests, and if the only reason we did that was because of our own economy and for our own flourishing, we would have lost the main reason, which is because these things are powerful, beautiful, rich, complex entities that have their value in themselves. They are intrinsic in their nature, not of extrinsic use to us.
Further, but in closing thoughts, I guess now for the listeners who have made it through all of this, any closing thoughts that might give them some sense of orientation or agency in the relationship to all these topics?
Well, I'd say, don't despair. That is achieving nothing whatever, and it's bad for the soul. So we have a duty to see what is hopeful and we're not asked, nobody is asked to do the impossible. We can only do the bit that we can. And that means doing things in our own life and with our own life and furthering larger causes in the way that we are best in a position to do. But we all have a role, and I think one of the things I tried to emphasize was that although the materialist reductionist picture results in a vision of the cosmos as a heap of junk with no meaning, beauty or purpose, and that we have no role here, I'd go to my death to defend the opposite point of view, that actually it is beautiful, it is rich, and it is our pleasure, our duty, and something we should be grateful for to help further that.
Yeah. I like that you said I would go to my death. That's the sacrifice in service of the sacred.
It needs to be a sacrifice.
Yeah.
I would want people to hear that the love of wisdom and the love of being are real possibilities, that there are already people of good faith and good talent doing this individually and collectively, and that opens up a possibility for a kind of transformation, so that as you fall in love with being again, instead of the reciprocal narrowing that we've just been talking about and how we get addicted, because that's what addiction is, reciprocal narrowing, a reciprocal opening is equally possible. This is what Plato proposed with anagoge, and that is still actual. And there are people and communities and practices that you can go to actualize that, to realize that. And there is nothing stopping you from doing that right now.
May I make a hemispheric comment?
Sure.
The left hemisphere closes down to a certainty. The right hemisphere opens up to a possibility. And so what you've really said is we need to further the processes of the right hemisphere, which are always expanding and exploring, rather than those that close down to the arid bit of something we think we know.
Yeah, I'm not proposing cognitive closure. I want continuity of contact.
I know you.
Yeah,
That's
yes.
why I said it. Yeah,
Yes, yes.
I think the concern about religions that many people have actually has to do with people orienting to certainty with them, and
Yes.
then
Yes.
closed-mindedness and holy wars and whatever, as opposed to the exact opposite, holding the mystery at the center, holding the unspeakable, the unknowable, but the real. And so there is a epistemic humility that is built in forever.
Yes.
We spoke about this yesterday, and you said don't despair, but we actually, I liked in our conversation, you were saying when we are actually open to the beauty of reality, there's a sense of awe and gratitude and humility that comes with that.
Exactly.
But when we're open to the beauty of reality being harmed, which is in the factory farm and on the war field and whatever, we're also feel the suffering of others, such that it's overwhelming.
I see.
And the overwhelm in the suffering and the overwhelm in the beauty are related, because if the reality wasn't beautiful, you wouldn't care. And both of them make you transcend your small self, and both of them motivate the sacred obligation.
Yeah.
So there's something where the sacred obligation just comes from seeing clearly, letting yourself be moved by the beauty of reality, and associated with that, the meaningfulness to protect it.
Yeah.
And the role of the new religion, philosophy, whatever, insofar as it can help people be more sensitive to both the beauty and sacredness, and thus a protective impulse towards reality, is what I am hoping people take away.
Excellent.